We live in the most materialistic of times. Much of the human race has somehow become convinced that the material world is all there is to existence, that meaning is an illusion produced by the human brain, and that there's no such thing as the realm of spirit. The adults in the room of our nascent global technocratic utopia worship at the altar of economic growth, at least publicly. And this regime has a clear message for those who believe there's more to life than the material world. Your beliefs are wrong. Your intuitions are wrong. Your vivid sense of your life being inherently meaningful is wrong. Revelation can come only from studies of the data and can be found printed in the pages of peer-reviewed journals only. So put your childish superstitions away and get with the program. But don't worry, the program has your best interests at heart. If you stick with us, we'll build machines of godlike intelligence. And if you're lucky, let you merge with them and become godlike yourself. So don't bother to train your mind or use your innate abilities to commune with nature or the divine. We've got an app for that. If that picture of modernity resonates with you, then this is the episode for you. Because in this episode of the New Age 2026 series, we're going to see how a man who died a century ago seemingly saw much of this world coming. His name was Rudolf Steiner, and he anticipated many of the themes we've talked about in this series, including the deification of materialist science, the perils of electrical technology, and attempts to merge man with machine. Steiner even said that humans would be visited by spiritual beings who would attempt to warn us about where our obsession with technology was heading. And he also had a sophisticated model of evil represented in the main by two beings, Lucifer and Ahriman. Lucifer, the bearer of false light, had already incarnated on Earth millennia ago, but Ahriman, the embodiment of materialism, would incarnate here in the future, and the ground would be prepared for his arrival. We're going to enter some pretty weird territory in this episode, so brace yourselves. But if you're still up for joining me, then welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. If you're enjoying this video, please do hit the like button. And if you want more of these videos in your life, then please do subscribe to the channel. Thanks, I appreciate you. Now, before we really get into this, I want to set some context for what I'm trying to do in this episode. I'm going to present some of Steiner's ideas here because I think they speak clearly to the themes of the Pluto-Neptune cycle we've been looking at in this series, and might help us to understand some of the spiritual undercurrents that underlie what we're seeing on the surface of things. And the fact that he arrived at many of his ideas at the time of the conjunctions of Pluto and Neptune in 1891 and 1892 that we've been considering in this series give them even more relevance. That said, I'm emphatically not a disciple of Steiner's, and I'm not arguing that he was right about everything. There is a serious issue with the work of many thinkers of this period, including Helena Blavatsky, who we also met in this series. And that's the taint of the colonialist and racist ideas that were common at this time in the West, which have to be acknowledged and honestly reckoned with. Delve into the work of almost any historical thinker and you'll find ideas that we today find unacceptable. But I think that to reject everything they said because we find some of their ideas problematic would be a mistake. The reality is that people can be deeply wrong about some things and right about others. But Steiner's accurate description of many features of our current moment leads me to suspect that he may well have been able to perceive some things that most of us cannot. And there is some compelling alignment between things Steiner said and the astrological cycles we've looked at in this series. So I decided that it was worth digging into some of his ideas with the very important caveat that I've given you right now. True wisdom is knowing what to take from the past and what to leave behind. Another thing to note is that Steiner was essentially an esoteric Christian thinker with many ideas resonant of the school of spiritual thought known as Gnosticism. I know there are people watching this channel coming from all sorts of backgrounds and parts of the world. So I just want to emphasize that you don't have to take Steiner's ideas literally. I present them here to you simply as food for thought. Finally, I'm very new to Steiner's thinking and to anthroposophy, the movement that he founded. So if any Steiner experts out there think I've misunderstood or misrepresented him, then I apologize in advance. That said, in the course of the research that's gone into this episode, I've been helped by some people who know a lot more about Steiner than I do, including Ashton Arnoldy and Charlie Cross. Heartfelt thanks to both of them. And thanks too to another person who helped me immensely with this research, Alex Harper. Alex is a brilliant astrologer and esotericist who also happens to host YouTube's Astrology Deathmatch show, in which astrologers are pitted against each other to identify people based on blind readings of their charts. Do check it out. It's a lot of fun and educational too. Link in the description below. So with that preamble out the way, let's get into this. Steiner was born in 1861 in what is now Croatia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he came of age during the Pluto-Neptune conjunctional period, the last quarter of the 19th century that we've been looking at in this series. Steiner began his career as a philosopher and scholar of the great German poet, writer, and polymath Johann Wolfgang Goethe. But from a young age, Steiner had spiritual leanings, and in 1899, he became involved with the Theosophical Society, which we examined in this earlier episode of the New Age 2026 series. And in 1902, Steiner became the head of its German section. But the Theosophical Society had moved its headquarters to India in 1882, and it had gradually begun to lean much more towards Eastern thinking, while Steiner increasingly emphasized the Christian dimension to Theosophy. And these differences became so pronounced that in 1912, Steiner split from the Theosophists to found his own movement, Anthroposophy, which is still very much alive and kicking today, and headquartered in Dornach, Switzerland. Like Goethe, Steiner was a polymath who wrote and lectured extensively on spirituality and esotericism and every aspect of life. He was a pioneer of organic or biodynamic farming. He was the founder of the Waldorf school movement, and he made significant contributions to the arts, including architecture and sculpture and a new form of dance that he called eurythmy. But it's his more esoteric ideas that we're going to focus on today, because Steiner was acclaimed clairvoyant who gave clear and detailed descriptions of spiritual realities. He taught methods of perceiving spiritual realms that involved training the mind to perceive what he called supersensible worlds, in other words, realities that exist beyond the ordinary senses. And in his writings, he gave clear, lucid descriptions of these realities. At the same time, he insisted that his followers shouldn't simply trust what he said. He emphasizes over and over that they should hone their own abilities and then verify what he said for themselves. He called his approach to clairvoyance and philosophy spiritual science. And as I've argued in this series, a major theme of the current Pluto-Neptune cycle is the reconciliation of science and spirituality. Here's the chart for the first conjunction of Pluto and Neptune at 8 degrees of Gemini in 1891. And if we look at what else is going on in this chart beyond the Pluto-Neptune conjunction itself, we see something interesting. Jupiter, ruler of the spiritual sign of Pisces, is in a very tight opposition with Saturn in Virgo, a placement speaking to the process of understanding the structure of material reality. In other words, we see the opposition between spirit and science. This is one of many reasons I think Steiner had tapped into the spirit of the times he lived through and the cycle that they initiated. But there are others, and one of them concerns something Steiner called the fall of the spirits of darkness. Like Blavatsky, Steiner talked about different historical ages that represented different stages in the development of human consciousness. Each of these ages lasted 2,160 years. And he said the current historical age, which he called the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, had begun around the year 1413. And that's interesting because you'll recall that the conjunctions of Pluto and Neptune moved into Gemini in 1398 and 1399 and would still have been just about in orb of conjunction in 1413. And so the astrology says clearly that a kind of new age did indeed begin at that time. And Steiner says the same thing, except Steiner died in 1925, several years before Pluto was discovered. So he couldn't have known anything about the Pluto-Neptune cycle, at least not by ordinary means. And then things get even weirder. Steiner also said that between the years of 1841 and 1879, a great battle had been waged in the heavens between the spirits of light and the spirits of darkness. Now, the spirits of light were led by the archangel Michael, or Michael. In 1879, Michael triumphed in this battle and cast the spirits of darkness out of the heavens and down into the world, our world. We see this battle represented in traditional images of Michael, in which he's seen battling a dragon, representing Satan. Now, if you've been following this series, you'll know that 1879 falls within the conjunctional period of the Pluto-Neptune cycle. That's very interesting on its own. But the references to the archangel Michael are especially fascinating. Steiner said that at this time, Michael assumed rulership of our times as a kind of Time Lord. Steiner called the period that began at this time and through which we're still living the Michaelic or Michaelic age. Now, you may well recall that the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions were tightly conjunct the star of Aldebaran. And Aldebaran is one of 4 so-called Watcher stars, each ruled by an archangel. And it happens to be the star that most astrologers today associate with, you guessed it, the archangel Michael. That's pretty strange. But Steiner made these statements in 1917, and Pluto wasn't discovered until 1930. That strongly suggests to me that he had perceived something. And Steiner wasn't the only one, because in 1886, Pope Leo XIII ordered that a prayer to St. Michael be said in every Catholic church after low mass. The prayer goes like this: St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Again, it's striking that this prayer to the archangel was introduced just as Pluto and Neptune were convening on the fixed star associated with Michael, and at the time when Steiner said Michael had cast the spirits of darkness down to earth. But what were these spirits of darkness, and what does it mean to say they've been cast down into the world? Well, to understand that question, we need to understand Steiner's conception of the nature of evil, and in particular, the beings he held to be responsible for it, Lucifer and Ahriman. You'll likely be familiar with the name Lucifer, which derives from Latin and means bearer of the light. Is Steiner's own sculpture of Lucifer. In Steiner's conception of Lucifer, we have a being who wants to guide us too quickly away from the earth into the heavens. Lucifer leads us towards losing ourselves in egoism, fantasy, and delusions of enlightenment. He wants to tempt us away from the earth, where we're meant to do the work of developing spiritually before we're really ready. Lucifer presents himself and his works as beautiful, yet he pulls us towards unbounded pursuit of beauty and pleasure, and thus decadence and ultimately evil. Astrologically, Lucifer is commonly associated with Venus, particularly Venus as a morning star. You'll recognize Venusian themes in what I've described above. But in Ahriman, we have a very different figure. Steiner borrowed the name Ahriman from the Zoroastrian religion, which gave this name to a being who served as the personification of evil and as the great adversary of the creator. But for Steiner, like Lucifer, Ahriman represents a particular aspect of evil. For Ahriman is the embodiment of materialism, and his agenda is to convince we human beings that the material realm is all there is, that there is no realm of spirit. Here's Steiner's sculpture of Ahriman. And to my mind, there are a couple of interesting things about it. Firstly, it resembles certain depictions of alien beings found in ufology. And secondly, from the perspective of astrological physiognomy, this is a Saturnine being. Saturnine figures are tall, thin, and gaunt. Saturn governs material reality, and when we're experiencing Saturn transits, we can have the feeling that we're trapped within the crucible of matter, that there's no escape from the crushing burdens of incarnation. And this is also the game of Ahriman. Steiner said that Ahriman's influence really began to grow with the acceptance of the Copernican theory of heliocentrism and the scientific revolution that followed. This, he said, was in essence a moment when many human beings ceased to trust their own senses, which perceived the sun and planets as revolving around the earth, and chose instead to trust in a model of reality that abstract theory told them to be true. That's interesting because, as we saw in this episode of this series, the Copernican theory came into the world in the early 16th century at the sextile phase of the first Pluto-Neptune cycle in Gemini. And of course, since that time, materialistic science has triumphed in the world, driven by related phenomena like capitalism and imperialism. That was true when Steiner was speaking of him in the early 20th century, and I suspect it's even more true today. Because there are some particular things that Steiner said about Ahriman and the spirits who serve him that suggest we're increasingly falling under his influence. Lucifer is associated with light, or more specifically, false light. Steiner said that Ahriman too is associated with a force, the force of electromagnetism. We've already seen in this series how technology based on electricity is shaping our world and human consciousness. And we've seen how the archetypal forerunners of electrical technology, like the transistor, can be traced back to the period of the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in the late 19th century. It was at that time that the world began to be electrified through the work of people like Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison, who happened to be a member of the Theosophical Society. Tesla, for his part, was known to be obsessed with the German folktale of Faust, which concerns a scholar, Faust, who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and power. Fancy that. This was also the time when the UFO phenomenon started to manifest as technology in the form of the wave of mystery airship sightings and encounters with their occupants in the US and further afield in the late 19th century. Now remember that this was also the time Steiner gives for the fall of the spirits of darkness. These we can assume would have been Ahrimanic and Luciferic beings who began to work within human beings to the ends of their two dark masters. Technology based on electromagnetism is essentially Ahrimanic. Steiner also said that our nervous systems, which of course are based on the transmission of electrical impulses, are Ahrimanic too. In fact, he said our nervous systems are run by an Ahrimanic spirit, which pairs with each human being when we're born. This is something we might refer to as a kind of doppelganger. Now think about how we're increasingly attaching ourselves to computational devices and networks running with electricity. We are, in a sense, extending our nervous systems by attaching them to machines. Steiner said that electricity was a kind of death force and that ideas that we hold in our memories are the, quote, corpses of ideas. What I think he meant by this is that ideas really exist as living entities that course through spiritual realities. Yet when we grab them and apprehend them and commit them to memory, we make what are essentially dead copies of them using our electricity-based nervous system. With this in mind, here's a quote about our time from Steiner in 1917. These forces, these death forces, will become ever more powerful, and the connection will be made between the death forces in the human being, which are related to electromagnetic forces, and outer machine forces. In a sense, the human being will be able to let his thoughts flow into the machine forces. Now consider this in light of something like Neuralink, Elon Musk's company that's literally putting microchips in people's brains. Steiner said that Lucifer and Ahriman would be working to essentially bind human beings to technology and thus to the material realm. They want to prevent us from developing spiritually on the earth, and instead, after our deaths, they want us to get caught in a fallen realm, coexisting with this one called the eighth sphere. I realize this is probably getting pretty far out. It would take a much deeper dive into Steiner's thought to know why this realm was numbered 8, but there is a reason. But I will note this. Here are the logos of two of the companies right at the forefront of building technology that extends or hacks our nervous systems. Those look a lot to me like 8s. And this may be a reach, but here's another one. Probably nothing. But Steiner's view of Lucifer and Ahriman was more nuanced than you might have so far realized, because he said that in fact, we need both of them. Is electrical technology evil? Should it all be just thrown away? Should we reject any kind of materialism, along with all the benefits that materialistic science has provided us with? Not so fast, cowboy. Steiner said that both Lucifer and Ahriman were necessary influences. Lucifer provides us with wisdom and inspires us with the desire to ascend. Ahriman forces us down to earth to view reality with cold rationality. But it's through Ahriman's influence that we've been able to gain greater understanding of material reality and to solve many of the problems that literally plagued people of the past. Steiner said this: the Ahrimanic tendencies in people today live themselves out in science, the Luciferic tendencies in religion, while in art, they swing between the one extreme and the other. While he said that both Lucifer and Ahriman had their roles to play, the problem with both of them is that they push us towards extremes. He said that what we need to do is balance between the impulses represented by Lucifer and Ahriman. Steiner said we should counter Ahriman's influence with Lucifer and Lucifer's influence with Ahriman's. In other words, we should find a kind of middle path. As I've mentioned, Steiner was a kind of esoteric Christian. He said that Christ's incarnation on earth was what had made it possible for us to perform this balance between Lucifer and Ahriman. Steiner was also clear that Lucifer and Ahriman, rather than being enemies, work hand in hand. Ahriman offers us material gains through rationality, while Lucifer offers us illusory, ecstatic, pseudo-spiritual experience, but both want to drag us down into the eighth sphere. Steiner said that Lucifer and Ahriman would conspire to inspire us to develop technologies that provide substitutes for spiritual experience. And this is indeed what we're seeing.
Experiences on Vision Pro can also expand in 3 dimensions, filling the entirety of your space. Like in the Mindfulness app, where you can create a moment of calm.
For example, witness this device, which supposedly enables lucid dreaming. Maybe it does, but lucid dreaming is a technique you can learn without the need for technology. But companies are appearing promising quick and easy routes to spiritual enlightenment. And clearly, what such devices push us towards is becoming dependent on technology, even for something as important and integral to your humanity as your dreams. So watch out. I find Steiner's model of evil to be instructive in terms of how our modern society has fallen out of balance, prioritizing and indeed exalting the Ahrimanic at the expense of all else. And when he spoke of these beings, he was clear on one thing: all of them would incarnate as human beings on Earth. We're all at least somewhat aware of the story around the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, the man that Steiner said hosted the Christ impulse for 3 years, from the time he reached the age of 30 until his death and resurrection aged 33. But he also said that Lucifer had incarnated on Earth too, and he was very specific about when and where this had happened. He said it had happened in the 3rd millennium BC in China. Lucifer, Steiner said, had brought the amazing pagan wisdom of antiquity to Earth, which had spread from China and informed the great pagan cultures of the world. Steiner wasn't saying this to dismiss ancient Chinese or pagan cultures. He was clear that they had a brilliance and that Lucifer had made it possible. But then came the incarnation of the Christ, which Steiner said was needed to allow balance to take place between Lucifer's influence, which was then still strong, and Ahriman, which would be coming in the future. But Steiner said that, quote, after a part of the 3rd millennium had passed, Ahriman too would also incarnate in human form on Earth, and that the ground would be prepared for his incarnation by the development of materialist science and thinking and technology. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying for sure that the incarnation of Ahriman is coming. I think the idea works well enough as a metaphor for our increasing seduction by materialist thinking. But I can't help but observe that if, as Steiner claimed, the world would be prepared in advance for Ahriman's arrival, then I imagine it might look a lot like our world looks now. Steiner said that Ahrimanic spirits worked through electrical impulses and the nervous system. And what's happening in the world right now but the expansion of human nervous systems using electrical technology? We're essentially building out a framework that Ahriman would surely find extremely inviting and would facilitate his agenda. But again, Steiner was speaking literally when he said that Ahriman would incarnate, and he said that Ahriman would incarnate in the West. And in anthroposophical circles, some have speculated about who Ahriman might be. Bear in mind that Steiner said the Christ only inhabited the man named Jesus of Nazareth for 3 years. So it's possible Ahriman's host, so to speak, isn't even hosting Ahriman yet. We should also bear in mind that Ahriman wants to trap us in a world of pure materialism. And so if he were to appear, he'd surely not present himself as someone who wants to harm us, but as our savior. And he'd save us with technology. You might well have noticed that the world is descending deeper and deeper into division and conflict right now. And if we don't already, we may well feel soon like a savior is desperately needed. But who might it be? Could it be Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, the man openly trying to bring a superhuman intelligence into being? Could it be our old friend Elon Musk, who is quite literally putting chips into people's brains? That was Ahrimanic an activity, as you can imagine. Now, you might note a resonance between this talk of the incarnation of Ahriman and the Christian idea of the Antichrist. As most of us know, the number of the beast is 666. And this has led some anthroposophists to wonder if Ahriman's host was born in 1998, which is 3 times 666. One famous person who was born in 1998 is this guy, Jimmy Donaldson, who happens to be the world's biggest YouTuber and goes by the name of, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast has a cool 240 million subscribers and likes to make videos about paying people money to do unpleasant things or giving money away for entertainment.
My friend Mac is about to experience the scariest moment of his life. I have to survive 10 minutes with 1,000 spiders to move on. And if he can successfully face all of the fears, he will win $800,000.
Nothing devilish about that, of course. And here's a clip of Mr. Beast talking about getting a Neuralink chip put into his own brain.
After the first couple thousand go through, I want one. Once the Neuralink actually works and you can be in symbiosis with technology and just download things to your brain, you'll be able to make so much money that it doesn't matter how much the procedure will cost.
Sounds like the kind of thing Ahriman's host body might do to prepare the ground for his incarnation, besides building himself an enormous platform with which to influence young minds. But I'm just having fun here. And again, just for fun, when might Ahriman's incarnation happen? Well, I can't help but notice the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune happening in 2026 at 0 degrees of Aries, i.e. the first degree of the entire zodiac. If there were a degree that symbolized the concept of incarnation, it would be this one. And what do we have in Saturn and Neptune but an incarnation of spirit? Perhaps an Ahrimanic spirit. And this conjunction is happening the same year that we get the basket configuration, which, as we've seen, seems to be signifying a moment of apotheosis in information technology. Look, again, I'm just having a bit of fun here, right? But I'm putting it out there just in case. So, what to take from all this? As you'll no doubt have gathered through this series, I have deep misgivings about information technology. And I suspect that at some point we will leave silicon-based information technology behind. But I don't think we've reached that time yet. I think we need to descend deeper into its grasp and to learn how to master it without letting it master us. Steiner insisted that there was nothing we could do to prevent Ahriman's incarnation. Now again, whether we take this literally or as a metaphor about technology, the point here is this: the only way out is through. Perhaps counterintuitively, the very power of this technology and its hold on us will force us to take up spiritual practices that counter its influence. We either do that or we submit to entering a technological prison, one from which it will be very difficult to emerge. And so again, when I look at the astrology of 2026, and particularly the basket of that year, I wonder if it represents a moment when the real peril of our situation begins, when we're seduced into a pleasurable, yet ultimately meaningless electronic prison. This would be devastating for us as spiritual beings. But will we really fall into the trap? Well, that's the risk, but help will be on the way. Remember, the world is not dominated only by forces of darkness. The forces of light act on us too. J. Allen Hynek, a legendary UFO researcher and close collaborator of Jacques Vallée, once said that if you want to understand the UFO phenomenon, you should read Rudolf Steiner's book, Theosophy. And I think he said that because Steiner provides us with a framework for understanding the spiritual realms that UFOs and their occupants may be coming from. In a lecture he gave in 1921, which I've linked in the description below, Steiner made some comments that seem to speak to this subject. He said this: "Since the end of the 70s of last century, other beings, not of the human order, have been descending to the earth for the purposes of their further development. From cosmic realms beyond the earth, they come down to the earth and enter into a definite relationship with human beings." This is interesting because Steiner says these beings started to appear in the late 1870s, the same time at which he said the spirits of darkness had been cast down by Michael to the earthly realm. This, remember, is the Pluto-Neptune conjunctional period, and also the period when the modern UFO phenomenon really started to manifest in the world. And who are these spiritual beings that have been visiting us? Steiner said that they were none other than human beings from the future, returning from a time when our species has been elevated to a more spiritual form of existence. There's a lot of debate in the ufology community about whether the non-human intelligences who appear from UFOs are malevolent or benevolent. While many encounters with quote-unquote aliens are terrifying, a lot of them are described as positive, with experiences reporting that they've been given messages by loving beings to look after each other and the Earth. But of course, most people remain pretty skeptical about the reality of these encounters. And Steiner also said this: the human race is behaving, if I may put it, so very shabbily to these beings who are appearing from the cosmos and coming down to the Earth. The human race does not concern itself with them. It ignores their existence. And it is this which will plunge the Earth into tragic conditions, for in the course of the next centuries, more and more spiritual beings will be among us, beings whose language we ought to understand. And what might happen if we ignore these beings? Well, here Steiner paints a pretty scary picture. Quote, "And from the Earth there will spring forth a terrible brood of beings, a brood of automata. This swarm will seize upon the Earth, will spread over the Earth like a network of ghastly spider-like creatures of an order lower than that of plant existence, but possessed of overpowering wisdom." This sounds to me a lot like the Earth being taken over by super intelligent, networked machines of some kind. In other words, this is a warning about where our obsession with technology could take us. We've almost reached the end of this series now. I have plenty more material I could add, but I think it's time to wrap it up and move on to other things. So there'll be one last episode in the series. And in the next and final episode, we'll try to somehow pull all these strands together and make some predictions about what might be coming in 2026 and the years beyond. Thanks, and see you next time.